The first thing I remember about that afternoon wasn't the laughter coming from my living room. It was the silence that came just before it. Anyone who has lived in a house full of people knows that every family has a rhythm. There are familiar sounds that make a place feel like home, and then there are moments when the quiet itself tells you something is wrong. As I stood outside my front door with grocery bags cutting into my fingers, I noticed my husband Malik's truck sitting in the driveway, even though he had texted me earlier saying he would be working late. My mother's sedan was parked beside it, along with my younger sister Nia's SUV. Nobody had called to tell me they were coming over. Nobody had asked if I would be home. At first I smiled because I thought they were planning some kind of surprise. My birthday was still weeks away, but my family had always found excuses to gather. I unlocked the door as quietly as I could, expecting to hear someone shout, "You're home." Instead, every voice suddenly stopped. It was the kind of silence that lasts only a second but feels much longer when your instincts begin asking questions your mind isn't ready to answer. I stepped into the hallway and called out, "I'm home," forcing excitement into my voice even though my stomach had already tightened. A few seconds later, my mother, Denise, walked into the hallway with the brightest smile I had ever seen her wear around me. She hugged me quickly, almost like she was trying to move me somewhere else before I could look past her. "We were just talking," she said. "Malik made coffee, and we decided to catch up." Her explanation sounded ordinary, yet nothing about the room felt ordinary. My sister barely looked me in the eye. My cousin Rochelle suddenly became interested in scrolling through her phone. Malik kissed my forehead and asked how my day had gone. But even his smile looked strained, as though he had spent the last hour answering questions he didn't want to answer. I told myself I was imagining things because suspicion can make ordinary moments feel unusual. Families have conversations. Families visit one another. There had to be a reasonable explanation. Still, I couldn't ignore the feeling that I had interrupted something that wasn't meant for me to hear. Before we go deeper into this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Stories like this remind us that the deepest betrayals don't always come from strangers. What happened to me changed the way I viewed love, loyalty, and family forever. And by the time I understood what was really happening, there were relationships that could never be repaired. Every detail matters, and what seemed like small moments at the time would later fit together in a way I never could have imagined. That evening should have faded into memory like countless family dinners before it. But instead it became the moment I would return to again and again, searching for the warning signs I had missed. My mother complimented Malik more than she spoke to me. She laughed at every joke he made, asked about his work, praised the way he handled finances, and reminded everyone how fortunate I was to have married a man like him. On the surface, those words sounded supportive, but after hearing them repeated over and over, I began noticing what she never said. She never complimented my career. She never asked about the promotion I had worked so hard to earn. She never celebrated my accomplishments with the same enthusiasm. Somehow, every conversation drifted back to Malik. I watched my sister studying his face whenever he spoke, and every time he looked in her direction, she smiled a little longer than seemed natural. It wasn't enough to accuse anyone of anything, but it was enough to make me wonder whether I was slowly becoming invisible inside my own family. The weeks that followed only deepened that feeling. Phone calls that once came to me started going directly to Malik. Family cookouts were planned through him instead of me. My mother would text him to ask whether we were free for the weekend without bothering to include me in the conversation. When I asked why, she laughed and said it was simply easier because he answered his messages faster than I did. Malik showed me every text he received and insisted there was nothing to worry about, but even he admitted the attention felt unusual. I wanted to believe him, because I loved my husband and trusted the life we had built together. Yet every new invitation, every unexpected visit, and every sideways glance left me with one question I couldn't shake. Why did it feel as though my family was working so hard to stay close to my husband while slowly drifting away from me? The more I tried to convince myself that I was overthinking everything, the more life seemed determined to prove that my instincts deserved to be heard. A few days after that uncomfortable family gathering, Malik walked into our bedroom looking exhausted. He sat on the edge of the bed without saying a word, loosened his tie, and stared at the floor long enough for me to notice that something was weighing on him. I asked if everything was all right at work, expecting him to tell me about another demanding client or another long meeting. Instead, he looked at me with the kind of expression that made me wonder whether he was deciding how much of the truth I could handle. After several seconds, he forced a smile and simply said he was tired. That answer should have ended the conversation, but it only created more questions. Malik had always been honest with me. We promised each other before we got married that secrets would never have a place in our home because we had both grown up watching relatives hide things until families broke apart. Seeing him hesitate was completely out of character, and although I wanted to respect his silence, I couldn't ignore the feeling that someone had placed him in an impossible position. Over the next 2 weeks, little moments began connecting in ways I couldn't explain. My mother called almost every evening asking whether Malik was home yet, but she rarely asked how I was doing. If I answered the phone, she would rush through a short conversation before saying, "Put Malik on for a second." When he finished speaking with her, I would casually ask what they talked about, and his answers always sounded harmless. She wanted advice about refinancing her house. She wanted recommendations for a mechanic. She wanted help understanding a bank statement. On their own, none of those conversations sounded unusual because Malik had always been generous with his time. He was the kind of man who believed helping family wasn't a burden, but a responsibility. That was one of the reasons I fell in love with him. Still, I couldn't understand why my mother suddenly depended on him for every decision when she had raised me to solve problems on my own. Even stranger, whenever I offered to help, she would politely decline before saying Malik understood these things better. Hearing those words over and over made me feel like a guest in my own family, watching someone else slowly take my place without anyone noticing how deeply it hurt. One Saturday afternoon, my best friend, Tasha, stopped by the house after running errands nearby. She had known me since college and possessed the rare ability to notice changes in my mood before I admitted them to myself. We sat on the back porch drinking sweet tea while the summer breeze moved through the trees, and after only a few minutes she leaned forward and asked, "What's really going on?" I laughed at first, hoping to brush off the question, but she wasn't convinced. I finally told her everything that had been bothering me. The endless phone calls, the private conversations, the awkward family dinners, and the growing feeling that everyone was treating Malik like the center of the family while I stood somewhere on the outside looking in. Tasha listened without interrupting, something she had always done whenever life became complicated. When I finished, she didn't immediately agree or disagree. Instead, she asked a question that stayed with me long after she drove away. Has Malik given you a reason not to trust him, or has everyone else given you a reason to question them? I realized I had been asking myself the wrong question all along. My trust in my husband had never really changed. It was everyone else's behavior that no longer made sense. That conversation should have given me peace, yet events over the following days made it impossible to relax. Late one evening, while folding laundry in our bedroom, I heard Malik's phone vibrate on the dresser. I wasn't searching for anything, and I had never believed in invading my husband's privacy, but the screen lit up just long enough for me to see part of a message before it disappeared. It read, "Please don't tell her yet. She wouldn't understand." There was no name visible because the notification vanished before I could read the rest. My heart immediately began racing. I stood frozen, staring at the black screen, trying to convince myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe someone was planning a surprise. Maybe it was about work. Maybe I had misunderstood what I saw. When Malik walked into the room a moment later, he picked up his phone almost instinctively, glanced at the screen, and slipped it into his pocket. Our eyes met for only a second before he smiled and asked what I wanted for dinner. I smiled back, but inside, one thought refused to leave my mind. If that message had nothing to hide, why did it feel like the beginning of a truth nobody wanted me to discover? I wish I could tell you that I confronted Malik the moment I saw that message, but that isn't what happened. When you've spent years building a life with someone you trust, your first instinct isn't always to accuse them. Sometimes it's to protect the version of your life that still feels safe. I carried that uneasy feeling with me for the next several days, hoping another explanation would present itself before my imagination filled in the blanks. Malik continued treating me with the same kindness he always had. He still made coffee every morning before I woke up, still texted me during lunch to remind me to eat, and still reached for my hand whenever we walked into church together on Sundays. If he was hiding something, he hid it better than anyone I had ever known. Yet every time his phone buzzed, I noticed him glance at it more quickly than before. Every time my mother's name came up in conversation, there was a hesitation that hadn't existed months earlier. Those pauses lasted only seconds, but when trust begins to crack, even a second can feel like an hour. I kept remembering Tasha's question about who had actually earned my suspicion, and I found myself watching my family more closely than I watched my husband. The answer didn't come from Malik. It came from my younger cousin, Camille, who had always struggled to keep family secrets. One afternoon she called me, sounding unusually nervous, and asked if we could meet for coffee after work. The moment I saw her sitting alone near the window, twisting a napkin between her fingers, I knew this wasn't going to be an ordinary conversation. She barely touched her drink before looking at me with eyes full of guilt. "I probably shouldn't be saying this," she whispered, "but I don't think it's right anymore." My heartbeat quickened as I leaned closer. Jamila explained that over the past few months my mother had been organizing small family gatherings whenever I was working late or traveling for business. At first, everyone believed she simply wanted to spend more time together, but eventually it became obvious that the invitations weren't really about family. She always made sure Malik would be there. If he declined, the gathering was suddenly canceled or postponed. Jamila admitted she found the pattern strange, but assumed there was something I already knew. When she realized I had no idea these meetings were even happening, the guilt became too much for her to carry. I thanked her for telling me, but I left that cafe feeling as though the ground beneath my feet had shifted. That evening, I didn't mention the conversation to Malik because I wanted to understand the full picture before making accusations I couldn't take back. Instead, I called my mother and casually asked what she was doing that weekend. She immediately told me she planned to stay home and rest because she'd had a busy week. Her answer sounded convincing until less than an hour later, when my aunt unknowingly called to invite me to a family barbecue my mother was hosting that same Saturday. She assumed I had already been invited. The silence that followed my explanation lasted several seconds before she awkwardly apologized and said maybe my mother had simply forgotten to call. Forgotten. That word echoed in my mind long after the conversation ended. How does a mother forget to invite her own daughter to a gathering she's organizing? I decided not to mention the invitation. Instead, I told my aunt I had other plans and quietly ended the call. For the first time, I wasn't interested in explanations. I wanted evidence. If something unusual was happening, I needed to see it with my own eyes instead of relying on fragments of conversations and uneasy feelings that could still be explained away. Saturday arrived with clear skies and unbearable tension. Early that morning, Malik told me he needed to stop by his office to review some documents before meeting a client later in the afternoon. His explanation sounded perfectly reasonable, and under any other circumstances I would have kissed him goodbye without another thought. Instead, after he left the driveway, I waited several minutes before getting into my own car. I wasn't proud of what I was doing, but I couldn't continue living between suspicion and certainty. I stayed far enough behind that he wouldn't notice me, expecting him to head toward downtown where his office was located. Instead, he exited the highway much earlier than usual and turned into a neighborhood where my mother lived. I parked several houses away, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear the traffic passing by. From where I sat, I watched him carry a small folder to my mother's front porch before she welcomed him inside with a hug. Minutes later, my sister Nia arrived, followed by my aunt and two cousins. It wasn't a barbecue. There were no grills, no decorations, no children running through the yard. This looked more like a private meeting, one I clearly wasn't supposed to know about. I remained in my car, unable to look away, completely unaware that what I was about to witness would challenge every conclusion I had already reached. From where I was parked, I couldn't hear a single word being said inside my mother's house, and that silence became its own kind of torture. Every passing minute gave my imagination another opportunity to create answers that might not have been true. I watched the curtains shift as people moved from one room to another. Once, I caught a glimpse of Malik standing near the dining room window with his arms folded across his chest while my mother spoke to him with animated gestures. He didn't look relaxed. He looked like a man trying to end a conversation without offending the person standing in front of him. My sister Nia paced across the room several times before disappearing into the kitchen. My aunt shook her head repeatedly as though she disagreed with something being discussed. None of it made sense. If this had been an ordinary family gathering, why was everyone so serious? Why had they gone out of their way to make sure I knew nothing about it? Nearly an hour later, the front door finally opened. One by one, everyone stepped outside. My mother embraced Malik again, holding both of his hands as she spoke. He gently pulled away, nodded once, and walked toward his truck without smiling. Before driving away, he sat behind the steering wheel for several moments, rubbing his forehead as if carrying a burden that refused to leave him. I had never seen him look that defeated, and for the first time since all of this began, I wondered whether he was trapped in something he didn't know how to escape. I waited until everyone had left before driving home another way, making sure Malik arrived before I did. When I walked through our front door, he was sitting at the kitchen island staring into a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. He looked up as I entered, smiled gently, and asked how my afternoon had been. I searched his face for any sign that he knew I had followed him, but there was nothing. For several seconds I considered telling him everything. I imagined placing my keys on the counter, looking him in the eye, and asking why he had lied about going to the office. Instead, I swallowed the words because I wanted him to tell me on his own. We spent the evening talking about work, making dinner together, and watching television, but every ordinary moment felt strangely distant. There was an invisible conversation sitting between us that neither of us acknowledged. As we prepared for bed, Malik reached for my hand and quietly said, "I know this has been a difficult few weeks. I wish I could explain everything right now." My heart stopped. Before I could ask what he meant, he kissed my forehead and added, "Just trust me a little longer." Then he turned off the bedroom light. Those 7 words stayed with me the entire night. Trust me a little longer. They sounded like a promise, but they also sounded like a warning. The following Monday brought an unexpected conversation that changed the direction of everything. My supervisor called me into his office shortly after lunch and congratulated me on being shortlisted for a leadership position that would require occasional travel between offices in different states. It was the kind of opportunity one had worked toward for years, and under normal circumstances I would have called my husband first. Instead, the first thought that crossed my mind was my family. If I accepted the promotion, there would be weekends when I wasn't home. For reasons I couldn't fully explain, that realization filled me with anxiety instead of excitement. On my drive home, I decided not to tell anyone until I had made a decision. I needed at least one piece of my life that belonged only to me. When I pulled into the driveway, however, I found my mother already waiting on the front porch. She greeted me warmly, complimented my outfit, and walked inside without waiting to be invited. Her visit felt carefully timed, though I had no proof that it was. She wandered through the living room, making small talk, before casually asking whether Malik would be home soon. She hadn't asked how my day had gone. She hadn't asked whether I wanted to sit down. Her first real question was about my husband. As we drank coffee in the kitchen, my mother suddenly reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. Her voice softened in a way I hadn't heard since childhood. She told me life had become expensive, retirement wasn't as comfortable as she had expected, and unexpected bills were beginning to pile up. I listened patiently, assuming she wanted advice or emotional support. Then she looked directly into my eyes and said something that immediately connected dozens of unanswered questions. "Malik has always been generous," she said quietly. "He understands what family means." I asked what she meant by that, and she quickly smiled before changing the subject, but the damage had already been done. That single sentence explained why every conversation seemed to revolve around him. It explained why she constantly wanted him involved in family decisions. It even explained why she appeared disappointed whenever he wasn't available. Yet one question remained unanswered. How generous had Malik actually been, and what exactly had my family been asking him to do? As soon as my mother left the house that evening, I knew I could no longer wait for the truth to reveal itself. The time had come to start asking questions that nobody in my family wanted to answer, even if the answers changed my life forever. That night, after my mother left, I sat alone at the kitchen table long after Malik had gone upstairs to shower. The house was quiet, but my mind refused to settle. I replayed every conversation from the past 6 months, searching for the moment everything had started to change. Looking back, I realized the shift had happened shortly after Malik received a promotion at work. His new position came with a significant raise, better benefits, and the kind of financial stability most families dream about. We celebrated together, thanking God for opening doors we had prayed over for years. My mother had been one of the first people to congratulate him. She hugged him tightly that evening and proudly told everyone, "This blessing belongs to the whole family." At the time, those words sounded loving. Now they carried a completely different meaning. Had she seen his success as something we had built together, or had she already begun viewing him as the solution to problems she hadn't shared with me? The question wouldn't leave me alone. I wasn't interested in money. I wanted honesty. Whatever was happening had stopped being about finances the moment lies became part of the conversation. When Malik came downstairs, he found me exactly where he had left me. He immediately sensed something was wrong and quietly pulled out the chair beside mine instead of sitting across from me. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, I looked at him and asked the question I had been avoiding for weeks. "Have you been giving my family money?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he closed his eyes for a brief moment, as though he had hoped this conversation could be postponed a little longer. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but heavy. "Yes," he admitted. "I have." Hearing those words felt like someone had knocked the air from my lungs. I asked him how long it had been happening. He lowered his head before quietly answering. "Almost 8 months. 8 months. Nearly a year of private conversations, secret meetings, and hidden financial decisions, all taking place without my knowledge." My emotions shifted between disappointment, confusion, and anger so quickly that I couldn't separate one from another. "Why would you hide something like that from me?" I asked. His answer came almost immediately. "Because your mother begged me not to tell you. She said she didn't want you carrying the weight of her problems." I wanted to believe him, but trust doesn't recover in a single conversation. I asked him to explain everything from the beginning, leaving nothing out. Malik took a deep breath and told me that shortly after his promotion, my mother had invited him to lunch. She confessed she was struggling financially after making several poor investment decisions and falling behind on loan payments she had hidden from the rest of the family. At first she asked for a small loan, promising to repay it within a few months. Malik agreed because he believed he was helping family through a difficult season. A few weeks later, she called again. Then again. Each request came with another explanation, another emergency, another promise that things would soon improve. Eventually, my sister Nia became involved, telling Malik our mother was embarrassed and asking him to keep everything between them because she didn't want me worrying. Every time he suggested telling me the truth, they insisted it would only create unnecessary stress. They reminded him how close I was to my mother and warned that revealing the situation might permanently damage our relationship. Looking back, he admitted he should have come to me immediately. Instead, he convinced himself he was protecting both my peace and my relationship with my family. The more he tried to help, the more dependent they became. As Malik continued speaking, pieces of the puzzle finally began fitting together. The family dinners, the private invitations, the endless phone calls. None of them had been about strengthening family relationships. They had been opportunities to ask for more help without involving me. My mother had learned that Malik found it difficult to refuse someone in genuine need, especially an older family member. She used that compassion again and again, gradually making him feel responsible for problems he hadn't created. Then Malik said something that stopped me cold. It wasn't just money anymore. I looked at him without speaking. He swallowed hard before continuing. Over the last few weeks, your mother started suggesting that since I handled finances better than anyone else, maybe I should become more involved in all of the family's decisions. She even joked that sometimes I understood her better than her own daughters. He paused before adding quietly. The jokes stopped feeling like jokes. A chill ran through my body. Suddenly, I remembered the strange comments, the lingering hugs, the way every conversation somehow centered on him. What I had dismissed as awkward behavior was beginning to reveal a much deeper pattern. My family hadn't simply crossed healthy boundaries. They had slowly tried to pull my husband into a role that should never have existed, all while convincing themselves they were justified because they believed they needed him more than I did. I sat in stunned silence as tears filled my eyes. I wasn't crying because of the money. Money could be replaced. What broke my heart was realizing that the people I loved most had spent months placing my husband in an impossible position, asking him to choose between honesty with his wife and loyalty to her family. Neither choice came without consequences. Malik reached for my hand, but before either of us could say another word, his phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen and immediately looked uncomfortable. Without saying anything, he slowly turned the phone toward me. The message was from my mother. It read, "We need you to come over tomorrow. Don't tell Camille yet. She'll only make things harder." I read those words twice before placing the phone back on the table. In that moment, every remaining doubt disappeared. This had never been a misunderstanding. It had been a carefully maintained secret, and for the first time since it all began, I knew exactly where the next conversation needed to happen. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my mother's message glowing on Malik's phone. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of months of deception. Don't tell Camille yet. That wasn't the language of someone trying to protect her daughter. It was the language of someone protecting a secret. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, I quietly walked downstairs and sat on the back porch, listening to the distant sound of traffic, while trying to understand how the woman who had taught me about honesty had become so comfortable asking my husband to keep things from me. I wasn't interested in revenge. I wasn't even interested in proving that I had been right. I wanted the truth, no matter how painful it turned out to be. When the sun finally rose, I had already made my decision. There would be no more guessing, no more following people in parking lots, and no more pretending everything was normal. Whatever happened next would happen face to face. Secrets had controlled this family long enough. Malik came downstairs just after 7, surprised to find me already dressed. Before he could ask where I was going, I told him I wanted us to visit my mother's house together. He looked at me for a long moment before quietly nodding. There was relief in his eyes, almost as if he had been waiting for this day himself. The drive across town felt much longer than it actually was. Neither of us turned on the radio. Neither of us filled the silence with small talk. We both understood that once we stepped through my mother's front door, nothing in our family would ever be the same again. When we arrived, several familiar cars were already parked outside. My sister Nia was there. My aunt was there. Even my cousin Rochelle had come. It didn't look like an ordinary visit. It looked like another one of the private meetings I had never been invited to attend. This time, however, I wasn't sitting outside wondering what was happening. I walked straight to the front door, knocked once, and waited. When my mother opened it and saw me standing beside Malik, The color drained from her face before she could force another smile. For several seconds, nobody spoke. My mother stepped aside, silently allowing us inside. The room that had once felt so welcoming suddenly felt unfamiliar. Everyone looked from me to Malik and back again, trying to understand why we had arrived together without warning. I remained standing. I didn't want coffee. I didn't want polite conversation. I wanted honesty. Looking directly at my mother, I asked a question so simple that there was no room to hide behind complicated explanations. Why have you been asking my husband to keep secrets from me? The room became painfully quiet. My aunt lowered her eyes. Rochelle shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Nia folded her arms, but said nothing. My mother took a slow breath before attempting the same explanation she had used with Malik for months. She claimed she had only wanted to spare me unnecessary stress because she knew I already had enough responsibilities at work. Before she could continue, I gently interrupted her. If protecting me was your goal, I asked, why was I the only person in this room who didn't know what was happening? No one answered. Their silence said more than any excuse could. It was my aunt who finally broke that silence. Her voice trembled as she admitted she had questioned the situation weeks earlier, but allowed herself to believe my mother knew what was best. Rochelle quietly confessed that she had assumed I had approved every financial decision because Malik never argued during the meetings. Then all eyes turned toward Nia. My younger sister stared at the floor for what felt like an eternity before speaking so softly I almost couldn't hear her. She admitted that our mother had convinced her this arrangement was temporary and that once the debts were paid, everything would return to normal. But then she said something that completely changed the atmosphere in the room. It stopped being about the money months ago. My heart immediately began racing. I asked her what she meant. Nia swallowed hard before looking directly at me for the first time that morning. Mom started depending on Malik for everything. Every decision. Every problem. Every disagreement. She kept saying he was the only one who could hold this family together. I slowly turned toward my mother, waiting for her to deny it. Instead, she remained silent, and that silence confirmed what I had feared more than anything else. My mother finally looked up, tears filling her eyes. But they weren't the tears of someone caught in a misunderstanding. They were the tears of someone whose carefully managed version of the truth was beginning to fall apart. She admitted that after my father's passing, she had become overwhelmed by responsibilities she had never expected to carry alone. At first, Malik's advice made her feel safe. Then his financial help made her feel secure. Eventually, she began believing that his presence solved every problem in her life. Instead of learning to stand on her own again, she leaned harder on my husband with every passing month. She convinced herself it was harmless because he was family, but somewhere along the way she stopped respecting the boundaries that protect a marriage. The private lunches became routine. The constant phone calls became expected. The family started contacting him before contacting me because that had become the pattern she encouraged. Then she looked at me with tears streaming down her face and whispered words I never thought I would hear from my own mother. I forgot that he was your husband before he was anything to the rest of us. Hearing that confession broke something inside me. It wasn't anger I felt anymore. It was grief. The greatest betrayal wasn't that my family wanted Malik's help. It was that they slowly convinced themselves they had a greater claim on his time, his loyalty, and his heart than I did as his wife. Nobody moved after my mother finished speaking. The room was so quiet that I could hear the old grandfather clock in the hallway marking each passing second. I looked around at the faces I had loved my entire life and realized something that hurt more than any confession I had heard that morning. Every person in that room had known at least part of the truth, yet every one of them had chosen silence. Some stayed quiet because they didn't want conflict. Others convinced themselves it wasn't their place to interfere. A few genuinely believed they were helping keep the family together. Different reasons, same outcome. I was the last person to learn what had been happening inside my own family. I turned toward Malik and saw tears gathering in his eyes. He wasn't crying because he had been exposed. He was crying because the burden he had carried for months had finally been placed in the open. For the first time since all of this began, I understood the exhaustion I had seen on his face. He had been trying to protect me from the truth, while the truth was quietly destroying our marriage anyway. My mother stood from her chair and slowly walked toward me, reaching for my hands the way she used to when I was a little girl afraid of thunderstorms. This time, I gently stepped back. It wasn't meant to punish her. I simply wasn't ready to pretend everything could be repaired with one apology. Tears rolled down her face as she admitted there was more I still didn't know. Several months earlier, after Malik refused another request for money, she had become afraid that he would finally tell me everything. Instead of accepting his decision, she called my sister and told her they needed to convince him to stay quiet a little longer. She worried that if I learned how serious her financial problems had become, I would insist on selling the family home or reporting some of the people who had taken advantage of her poor decisions. Rather than trusting me to stand beside her, she chose manipulation over honesty. She admitted that every family dinner, every surprise visit, and every private meeting had one purpose: keeping Malik close enough that she could continue depending on him without facing me. As painful as those words were, another realization hit me even harder. She had never stopped seeing me as her daughter. She had simply stopped seeing me as an adult capable of handling the truth. Before I could respond, Nia began crying. She looked directly at Malik and apologized for every uncomfortable position she and our mother had placed him in. She admitted that more than once she had encouraged him to keep quiet because she believed the truth would only create a permanent division in the family. Then she turned toward me, struggling to hold back tears. "I was jealous," she whispered. The room fell silent again. "Not because I wanted your husband," she continued, "but because I wanted the kind of marriage you had. Every time Mom praised Malik, I compared my own relationships to yours. Instead of working on my life, I allowed myself to resent yours." Her honesty caught everyone by surprise. For months, I had interpreted her behavior as competition for my husband, but the truth was different. She hadn't wanted Malik himself. She wanted the stability, respect, and security she believed our marriage represented. That envy had made it easier for her to excuse boundaries that should never have been crossed. It didn't erase the hurt she had caused, but it helped me understand how easily unaddressed resentment can grow into actions that damage the people we claim to love most. I finally looked at my mother and asked the question that had haunted me from the beginning. "When you said this blessing belonged to the whole family after Malik's promotion, did you really believe that?" She lowered her head before quietly answering yes. She explained that after years of financial struggles and emotional hardship following my father's death, she had convinced herself that families should share everything equally, including success. Somewhere along the way, she blurred the line between accepting help and expecting it. Instead of celebrating our marriage as something to protect, she began treating it as a resource everyone could draw from whenever they needed it. She admitted she never intended to come between us, yet every decision she made pulled Malik further into responsibilities that belonged to her alone. Looking back, she finally recognized what she had refused to see for months. Love without boundaries can become control. Dependence disguised as family loyalty can slowly erode trust until the people closest to you no longer know where they stand. Those words hung in the air long after she finished speaking because every person in the room understood they were true. I took a slow breath before speaking again. "I forgive you," I said quietly, watching relief begin to appear on several faces around the room. Then I continued before anyone could misunderstand what I meant. "But forgiveness doesn't mean life goes back to the way it was." The relief disappeared just as quickly as it had come. I explained that trust isn't rebuilt with promises. It's rebuilt through consistent actions over time. From that day forward, there would be no private conversations with my husband that excluded me. No financial requests made through him instead of through me. No family meetings where I was intentionally left out. If anyone needed help, they would come to both of us openly or not at all. Most importantly, I told my mother that our marriage would never again be treated as a solution to problems that belonged to someone else. She nodded through tears, knowing she had no right to argue. As Malik reached for my hand, I realized something that changed my understanding of strength forever. Sometimes saving a marriage isn't about fighting the person you married. Sometimes it's about having the courage to protect that marriage from the people who believe they have the right to stand inside it. That morning didn't end our family's pain, but it marked the beginning of something we had avoided for far too long. Living in the truth, no matter how uncomfortable that truth might be. Leaving my mother's house that afternoon didn't feel like the ending of a painful chapter. It felt like walking out of a courtroom where everyone had confessed, but no sentence had yet been carried out. The drive home was almost silent. Malik kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other resting gently over mine, but neither of us seemed to know what to say. Some wounds are too fresh for words, and this was one of them. As we pulled into our driveway, I looked at the house we had built together and realized how close we had come to losing something neither of us had intentionally damaged. We had survived because, despite the secrets, our commitment to each other had never disappeared. It had simply been buried beneath months of fear, misplaced loyalty, and decisions made by people who believed they were protecting the family while slowly breaking it apart. That evening, for the first time in months, Malik and I sat across from one another without unanswered questions hanging between us. The truth had finally entered our home, and although it hurt, it also brought something we hadn't felt in a very long time: peace. Over the next several weeks, life became noticeably quieter. My mother's daily phone calls stopped almost completely. The constant text messages that had once interrupted every evening disappeared. Family gatherings became less frequent because people were finally learning that access to our marriage was no longer something they could assume. At first, the silence felt strange. I had spent so many months surrounded by tension that I almost expected another crisis to appear every morning. Instead, the quiet became an opportunity for healing. Malik and I started taking evening walks through the neighborhood after dinner, something we had stopped doing during the months when every conversation seemed to revolve around my family. We talked about everything we had neglected while trying to survive the chaos. Our future, our faith, our dreams of starting a family of our own one day, and the lessons we wished we had learned sooner. One evening, Malik stopped walking, looked at me with complete sincerity, and apologized again for keeping those secrets. I told him I accepted his apology, but I also admitted something difficult about myself. I should have trusted my instincts sooner, I said. Instead of asking uncomfortable questions, I kept convincing myself I was imagining things. We both realized that healthy marriages require honesty, even when honesty creates temporary discomfort. Avoiding difficult conversations had nearly cost us something much greater. About 2 months later, my mother called and asked if we could meet at a small park where my father used to take us when we were children. I wasn't sure whether I was ready, but after praying about it for several days, I agreed. When I arrived, she was already sitting on a bench overlooking the lake, holding an old family photo album. She looked older than I remembered, not because time had suddenly caught up with her, but because carrying guilt has a way of changing a person's face. She smiled softly as I sat beside her and opened the album to pictures from my childhood. We laughed quietly at old birthdays, church picnics, family reunions, and vacations we could barely afford, but somehow enjoyed anyway. After several minutes, she closed the album and looked at me with tears in her eyes. I spent so much time trying to hold this family together, she said, that I forgot the family wasn't mine to control. Those words stayed with me. For the first time since everything had happened, I believed she truly understood the difference between love and control. She handed me the album and asked me to keep it because she wanted me to remember the family we had been before fear and pride began making decisions for us. I hugged her that afternoon, not because everything had been fixed, but because healing had finally become possible. Several months later, my promotion became official, and with it came opportunities one had once been afraid to accept. Instead of worrying about what my family might do while I was away, I traveled with confidence because Malik and I had rebuilt the trust that had carried us through the hardest season of our marriage. My mother slowly began rebuilding relationships with the rest of the family as well, this time without expecting anyone else to solve problems she needed to face herself. She sold the house she could no longer afford, paid off much of her debt, and started living within her means. It wasn't an easy journey, but it was an honest one. Nia also began focusing on her own life instead of comparing it to mine. She returned to school, started a new career, and often told me that learning to celebrate someone else's blessings instead of measuring them against her own had completely changed the way she viewed success. Watching those changes reminded me that people are capable of growth when they are willing to confront the truth instead of hiding from it. Looking back now, people often ask me what hurt the most about everything that happened. They expect me to talk about the secret meetings, the hidden financial help, or the lies that lasted for months. But those weren't the deepest wounds. The deepest wound was realizing how easily love can become unhealthy when it is no longer guided by respect for boundaries. My family didn't wake up one morning intending to damage my marriage. They reached that point one small compromise at a time. One hidden conversation became two. One private favor became another. That's why I share this story today. If there's one lesson my experience taught me, it's this. Every healthy relationship deserves clear boundaries, even with the people you love most. The truth changed my life forever, not because it destroyed my family, but because it finally showed me that protecting your marriage isn't an act of selfishness. Sometimes, it's the greatest act of love you can offer both your spouse and yourself.